At Willow Grange, a deadly breakfast strikes Sir Henry Ashford, poisoned, with rye grains as the only clue. When his wife Clara falls next, the nursery rhyme, "Sing a song of sixpence," turns sinister. A killer hides among family secrets. Only Miss Marple can unravel the clues. Blackmail, betrayal, and a deadly motive tied to wealth. But who's next? Greed sings a deadly song. Will Miss Marple stop the murderer before the rhyme claims another? Watch the shocking truth unfold. Chapter 1. The Death at Willow Grange. The autumn sun cast a frail golden glow over Willow Grange, its beams filtering through the heavy velvet curtains of the dining room. The house, a sprawling Georgian relic on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead, stood as a testament to the Ashford family's wealth, its ivy-clad walls whispering of old money and older secrets. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and freshly brewed tea, but an undercurrent of tension simmered beneath the morning's routine. Sir Henry Ashford, a textiles magnate whose empire stretched from Manchester to Madras, presided over the breakfast table with the authority of a monarch. His broad shoulders filled the high-backed chair, and his steel-grey eyes surveyed the room with a mixture of disdain and vigilance. At 62, his face bore the lines of a man who had crushed competitors and silenced detractors. Yet his hands, gripping the Times, trembled ever so slightly, a detail not lost on the observant. Opposite him sat his wife, Clara, a fragile woman of 50 whose nervous flutterings belied her once vibrant beauty. Her delicate fingers toyed with a silver spoon, stirring her tea in ceaseless circles, her eyes darting to her husband as if expecting rebuke. Clara's pale blue dress, though elegant, seemed to hang on her, as though she had shrunk within it. She murmured something about the weather, her voice barely audible, and received no reply. To Sir Henry's left, their son Julian slouched in his chair, his boyish features marred by a petulant frown. At 30, Julian had the air of a man who had never quite escaped his father's shadow. His dark hair was dishevelled, and his tie hung loosely, as if he had dressed in haste. He scanned the Financial Times, though his eyes flickered restlessly toward the window, where the garden's bare trees swayed in the breeze. Julian's breakfast, poached eggs and toast, remained untouched, a silent rebellion against the morning's formality. Beside him, Beatrice, Julian's wife, exuded a calculated poise that contrasted sharply with the room's unease. Her auburn hair was swept into an impeccable chignon, and her pearl necklace gleamed against her emerald green dress. Beatrice's beauty was of the polished sort, the kind that demanded attention, yet deflected scrutiny. She sipped her coffee with deliberate grace, her green eyes scanning the table, lingering briefly on Clara's trembling hands before returning to her own plate. If she sensed the room's tension, she gave no sign of it. The maid, Elsie, moved silently, her plain grey uniform blending into the room's sombre palette. A young woman of 20, with mousy hair and a perpetually anxious expression, Elsie poured coffee with hands that shook slightly, betraying her unease. She had been with the Ashfords for only 6 months, and the weight of Sir Henry's disapproval seemed to press on her like a physical force. As she refilled Julian's cup, a droplet spilled, and Sir Henry's eyes snapped to her. "Clumsy girl!" he barked, his voice cutting through the room's quiet. Elsie flinched, murmuring an apology, and retreated to the sideboard, her cheeks flushed. Clara offered a weak smile, but no one else acknowledged the exchange. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, its rhythm a counterpoint to the strained silence. Sir Henry set down his newspaper and reached for his teacup, a fine bone china piece adorned with gold filigree. He took a sip, then grimaced, his heavy brows knitting together. "This tea is vile," he muttered, his voice low but sharp. "What's in it, girl?" He glared at Elsie, who froze, her hands clutching the coffee pot. "It's the usual, sir," she stammered. "Darjeeling from the tin in the pantry." Sir Henry snorted, taking another sip, then coughed, a harsh guttural sound that made Clara start. "Tastes like poison," he growled, but his tone held a grim humour, as if such a notion were absurd. He raised the cup again, but before it reached his lips, his hand faltered. The cup slipped clattering against the saucer, and Sir Henry clutched his chest. His face contorted, turning a sickly grey, and a strangled gasp escaped him. "Henry!" Clara cried, leaping to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor. Julian dropped his newspaper, his eyes wide, and rushed to his father's side. Etty remained seated, her hands folded, though her knuckles whitened. Elsie backed away, the coffee pot trembling in her grasp. Sir Henry's massive frame slumped forward, his forehead striking the table with a dull thud. The teacup rolled to the floor, shattering into jagged shards. Tea pooled on the polished wood, mingling with the scattered crumbs of toast. Clara's screams filled the room, high and piercing, as Julian shook his father's shoulder, calling his name. But Sir Henry Ashford was beyond response, his eyes staring blankly, his breath stilled. "Fetch Dr. Hargreaves!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking. Elsie bolted from the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Beatrice rose at last, moving to Clara's side, her movements deliberate. She placed a hand on her mother-in-law's arm, murmuring soothing words, but her eyes flicked to the table, where the spilled tea glistened. Dr. Hargreaves, a wiry man with a perpetually furrowed brow, arrived within the hour, his black bag clutched tightly. The dining room had been cleared, save for Sir Henry's body, now covered with a white cloth from the linen closet. The family waited in the drawing-room, Clara sobbing into a lace handkerchief, Julian pacing, and Beatrice staring out the window, her expression unreadable. Hargreaves emerged after a brief examination, his face grim. "Poison," he said flatly, addressing Julian, who had followed him back to the dining room. "Likely in the tea, though I'll need tests to confirm. Cyanide, by the smell of it. Bitter almonds, unmistakable. I must notify the police." Glum paled, his hands clenching. "Poison! That's impossible. Who would—" He stopped, his eyes darting to the table where the broken teacup lay. Hargreaves followed his gaze, then paused, his attention caught by something else. Tucked into Sir Henry's napkin, folded with eerie precision, was a small pile of rye grains, their dark husks stark against the white linen. "What the devil?" Hargreaves muttered, reaching for the napkin. Julian stepped forward, but Elsie, who had re-entered the room, gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Rye, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling, "like in the rhyme." "What rhyme?" Julian snapped, his nerves fraying. Elsie hesitated, then recited in a shaky voice, "Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye." She trailed off, her eyes wide with fear. Hargreaves frowned, dismissing her words with a wave. "Nonsense! This is a crime scene, not a nursery." But the grains troubled him, their presence too deliberate to ignore. He instructed Elsie to leave the napkin untouched and sent for Inspector Grayson, the local police officer known for his methodical, if unimaginative, approach. As the household awaited the inspector, the dining room seemed to grow colder, the ticking clock louder. Clara's sobs echoed from the drawing room. Julian's pacing grew frantic, and Beatrice's calm felt like a mask, brittle and thin. Elsie lingered in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the rye grains as if they held some dark prophecy. And outside, the autumn wind whispered through the trees, carrying the first chill of a mystery that would soon unravel the secrets of Willow Grange. Chapter 2. The Inspector Arrives. The clock in the hall of Willow Grange struck noon, its chimes reverberating through the house like a solemn knell. The dining room, where Sir Henry Ashford had met his untimely end only hours before, was now a silent tableau of tragedy. The shattered teacup lay untouched on the floor, its spilled contents dried into a dark stain on the polished wood. The pile of rye grains, nestled in the napkin, seemed to mock the room's stillness, their presence an enigma that hung over the household like a storm cloud. Inspector Arthur Grayson arrived promptly, his sturdy frame filling the doorway as he stepped into the foyer. A man in his late 40s, with a square jaw and eyes that missed little, Grayson carried an air of quiet competence. His tweed suit, though well-tailored, bore the faint creases of a morning spent on other cases, and his notebook, already open, was a testament to his methodical nature. He nodded curtly to Dr. Hargreaves, who greeted him with a grim handshake. "Poison, you say?" Grayson's voice was low, clipped as he surveyed the dining room. "Cyanide, most likely. And these rye grains, what's their meaning?" Hargreaves shrugged, his brow furrowed. "Your guess is as good as mine, Inspector. The tea was laced, that's certain. The grains, some sort of signature, perhaps. Elsie, the maid, mentioned a nursery rhyme." Grayson's eyes narrowed. "A rhyme? Let's have the facts first." He turned to the family, who had gathered in the drawing-room, their faces a study in varied distress. Clara Ashford sat on a brocade sofa, her delicate frame trembling as she clutched a damp handkerchief. Her pale eyes were red-rimmed, and her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. Julian, her son, stood by the fireplace, his hands thrust into his pockets, his restless pacing stilled only by the inspector's arrival. Beatrice, Julian's wife, occupied an armchair, her posture as composed as a portrait, though her fingers toyed with the edge of her sleeve, a rare betrayal of unease. Elsie hovered near the door, her mousy features taut with anxiety, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. Grayson began with Clara, his tone gentle but probing. "Mrs. Ashford, when did you last see your husband before this morning?" Clara's lips quivered. "Last night, Inspector. We dined together, Henry, Julian, Beatrice and I. He was preoccupied, but he often was. Business, you know." Her voice broke, and she pressed the handkerchief to her mouth. "Preoccupied how?" Grayson pressed, his pencil poised. "He was sharp with everyone," Clara admitted. "He snapped at Elsie over the soup, and he argued with Julian about money, I think. Henry was always so particular." Grayson turned to Julian, whose jaw tightened. "Is that true, Mr. Ashford? An argument?" Julian shrugged, his eyes avoiding the inspector's. "Father was in a foul mood. He thought I was careless with the accounts. It was nothing unusual. He always found fault." His tone was defensive, and he shifted his weight, as if eager to escape scrutiny. "And you, Mrs. Beatrice Ashford?" Grayson's gaze settled on Beatrice, who met it with a cool, measured look. "I noticed nothing out of the ordinary," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Henry was his usual self, demanding perhaps, but no more than usual. If there was tension, it was between him and Julian." Her words carried a faint edge, and Julian shot her a glare, which she ignored. Grayson jotted a note, then beckoned Elsie forward. The maid approached reluctantly, her eyes darting to the family as if seeking permission. "You served the tea, Elsie," Grayson said. "Did you notice anything odd? The taste, the smell?" Elsie shook her head vigorously. "No, sir, it was the Darjeeling, same as always. I brewed it myself in the kitchen. I'd never—" She stopped, her voice catching, and Grayson raised a hand to calm her. "No one's accusing you, girl. Just tell me what you saw." Elsie swallowed hard. "When Sir Henry coughed, I thought he was just cross. But then he fell, and I saw the rye after, in his napkin, like it was meant to be found." Grayson frowned, returning to the dining room to examine the grains himself. As he crouched by the table, his fingers brushed against a scrap of paper tucked beneath a table leg, nearly invisible against the rug. He retrieved it, unfolding it to reveal a single line, scrawled in a hurried hand. "Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye." "What's this nonsense?" Grayson muttered, holding the paper to the light. The ink was fresh, the writing unsteady, as if penned in haste. He showed it to Hargreaves, who shook his head. "Someone's playing games," the doctor said. "A murderer with a flair for drama." Grayson slipped the paper into an envelope, his mind racing. He questioned the family again, probing for enemies. Clara insisted Henry had none, though her voice lacked conviction. Julian mentioned a former business partner, Mr. Carver, who had threatened Henry after a failed venture years ago. "He's in London now," Julian said. "Probably harmless, but father never forgot a grudge." Beatrice, her tone measured, added, "Henry was ruthless in business. He made enemies, Inspector, even if we didn't see them at our table." Her words were careful, but Grayson sensed a deeper meaning, as if she were testing him. Elsie, when pressed, recalled a stranger who had visited Sir Henry a week prior, a Mr. Lyle who had dined with the family and left abruptly. "Sir Henry was cross after," Elsie whispered, "said Mr. Lyle was no good." Grayson noted the name, resolving to trace this Lyle. As the inspector concluded his interviews, the drawing-room grew oppressive, the weight of suspicion settling over the household. Clara's sobs had subsided, replaced by a haunted silence. Julian resumed his pacing, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting another blow. Beatrice's composure held, but her fingers now gripped the armrest, her knuckles pale. Elsie retreated to the kitchen, her footsteps quick and fearful. Grayson lingered in the dining room, staring at the rye grains and the cryptic note. The nursery rhyme, with its kings and queens and blackbirds, seemed a childish taunt, yet its presence chilled him. He was a man of facts, not fancies, but he could not shake the feeling that the rhyme was a key, a deliberate thread woven into a tapestry of deceit. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows, and the shadows lengthened across Willow Grange. The inspector tucked his notebook away, unaware that in St. Mary Mead a certain Miss Jane Marple was already turning her sharp mind to the mystery, her knitting needles poised like the first moves in a game of deadly chess. Chapter 3. Miss Marple's Interest. The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in the gentle folds of the English countryside, its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the pale light of an autumn afternoon. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and the church spire stood sentinel over the green, where children played, oblivious to the shadow that had fallen over Willow Grange. News of Sir Henry Ashford's death had spread swiftly, as news always did in such a place, carried on whispers in the post office and murmurs over tea at the Blue Boar. By midday, the village buzzed with speculation, each tongue adding its own flourish to the tale of poison, rye grains, and a nursery rhyme. At her cottage on the edge of the village, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking with the steady rhythm of a metronome. The room was a cosy haven, its chintz curtains framing a view of the garden, where chrysanthemums bowed under the weight of early frost. A fire crackled in the grate, casting a warm glow over the polished furniture, and a tray of tea things sat on the table, the pot still steaming. Miss Marple's appearance, soft white hair, gentle blue eyes, and a delicate frame swathed in a lavender cardigan, suggested nothing more than a kindly spinster. But those who knew her understood the steel beneath the softness, the mind that unravelled secrets as deftly as her fingers worked wool. Her maid, Florence, bustled in, her round face flushed with the excitement of gossip. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple," she began, setting down a plate of scones. "Sir Henry Ashford, dead at his own breakfast table. They're saying it was poison, cyanide, no less, and there were rye grains, of all things, right there in his napkin." "And a bit of a rhyme," Elsie told Mrs. Carter at the post office. "Sing a song of sixpence, if you can believe it." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes lifting from the half-formed scarf in her lap. "Rye grains and a nursery rhyme," she murmured, her voice soft but tinged with curiosity. "How very peculiar, Florence. And Elsie, she's the maid at Willow Grange, isn't she? A nervous girl, I recall." "That's the one," Florence nodded, pouring tea. "Scared out of her wits, Mrs. Carter says. Thinks it's a cursed silly thing. But poison, Miss Marple. Who'd do such a thing to Sir Henry? He was a hard man, mind you, but murder?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already turning over the fragments of the story. Sir Henry Ashford had been a formidable figure, his wealth built on textiles and his reputation on ruthlessness. She remembered him from a charity bazaar some years ago, his booming voice and imperious manner dominating the vicar's garden. Clara, his wife, had seemed a shadow beside him, her smiles tentative, her words few. Their son, Julian, and his wife Beatrice were less familiar to her, but village talk painted Julian as reckless and Beatrice as ambitious, qualities that, in Miss Marple's experience, often led to trouble. "The rhyme is intriguing," she said, setting her cup down. "Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye. It's an old verse, Florence, about kings and queens and blackbirds." A pocket full of rye suggests wealth, perhaps, or deception. And the grains, such a deliberate touch. Not the sort of thing one scatters by accident. Florence's eyes widened. You think it's a clue, miss? Like in one of those detective stories? Perhaps, Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, but her mind sharp. Or perhaps it's meant to mislead. People are rarely as clever as they think, Florence, but they do like to leave their mark. She resumed her knitting, though her thoughts were far from the scarf. Poison was a personal weapon, requiring access and intent. The rye and the rhyme suggested a mind that delighted in theatrics, yet the choice of cyanide, swift and brutal, spoke of urgency. She resolved to learn more, and the best place to begin was Willow Grange itself. An hour later, Miss Marple set out, her black handbag tucked under her arm, and a woolen shawl draped over her shoulders. The walk to Willow Grange was pleasant, the lane lined with hedgerows, and the air alive with the chatter of sparrows. She passed the vicarage, where Reverend Clements was pruning roses, and exchanged a nod with Mrs. Price, who was sweeping her doorstep. The village seemed unchanged, yet Miss Marple sensed a current of unease, as if the murder had stirred something dormant in St. Mary Mead's quiet heart. Willow Grange loomed at the end of a gravel drive, its Georgian facade imposing despite the ivy that softened its edges. The windows gleamed, but the house felt watchful, its silence heavy with secrets. Miss Marple rang the bell, and Elsie opened the door, her face pale and her eyes darting nervously. "Oh, Miss Marple, Elsie," said, her voice a whisper. "Mrs. Ashford's in the drawing-room. It's been awful, miss. I didn't know what to do when Sir Henry—" She stopped, her hands twisting her apron. There, Elsie," Miss Marple said gently, patting her arm. "You've had a shock. Just show me to Mrs. Ashford, and we'll have a little chat." Elsie nodded, leading her through the hall, where portraits of stern-faced Ashfords glared from the walls. The air smelled of beeswax and old roses. But there was a faint tang of something sharper. Fear, perhaps. Clara Ashford sat in the drawing-room, a fragile figure in a high-backed chair. Her pale blue dress was crumpled, and her hands clutched a crumpled handkerchief. The room was elegant, with damask curtains and a marble fireplace, but it felt stifled, as if the air had not moved since morning. Beatrice stood by the window, her auburn hair catching the light, her expression one of studied calm. Julian was absent, though his presence lingered in the half-empty whiskey glass on the sideboard. "Jane," Clara said, her voice trembling, as she rose. "How kind of you to come. It's been dreadful." Her eyes filled with tears, and Miss Marple took her hand, guiding her back to the chair. "My dear Clara," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but firm, "I was so sorry to hear of Henry's death. Such a terrible thing. I thought I might offer my condolences, and perhaps a little company." Clara nodded, dabbing her eyes. "You're very good, Jane. I don't know what to think. Poison, they say, and those awful rye grains. It's like a nightmare." Beatrice turned from the window, her green eyes assessing Miss Marple. "It's a tragedy, of course," she said, her voice smooth. "But the police are handling it. Inspector Grayson seems thorough." There was a faint note of disdain in her tone, as if she doubted Grayson's competence. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "I'm sure he is, Mrs. Ashford. The police are so clever these days. But it's the little things, isn't it, that catch one's attention? Like those rye grains. So odd, don't you think? Clara shuddered. Horrible, she whispered. I can't bear to think of it. Henry was so particular about his tea. Who could have done such a thing? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the room, noting the details. The ticking ormolu clock, the vase of wilting dahlias, the faint scuff on the rug near the door. Tell me, Clara, she said, her voice gentle. Had Henry seemed himself lately? Any new acquaintances, perhaps, or worries? Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. He was restless, she admitted, more than usual. There was a man, Mr. Lyle, I think, who came to dinner last week. Henry didn't like him, I could tell. They talked in the study afterward, and Henry was cross when he came out. Lyle? Miss Marple repeated, filing the name away. A business associate. I suppose so, Clara said vaguely. Henry never told me much about his work, but he was short with everyone after that, even Julian. Beatrice interjected, her tone crisp. Henry was always short with Julian. It was no secret he thought Julian irresponsible. As for Mr. Lyle, I barely spoke to him. He seemed ordinary. Her words were dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her jaw. The door opened, and Julian entered, his dark hair dishevelled and his tie askew. He stopped short at the sight of Miss Marple, his expression wary. Miss Marple, he said, forcing a smile. Didn't expect to see you here. I came to see your mother, Miss Marple said, her tone mild. Such a sad time for you all. Julian nodded, moving to the sideboard to pour another whisky. Sad doesn't cover it, he muttered. Father, poisoned. It's madness. Grayson's poking around, but he's got nothing. Miss Marple's eyes followed him, noting the tremor in his hand as he lifted the glass. The inspector must start somewhere, she said. And the rye grains, the rhyme, such curious details. They make one wonder, don't they? Julian's glass paused at his lips. Wonder what? It's some lunatic's idea of a joke. Father had enemies, sure, but this? He shook his head, draining the glass. Beatrice's lips curved slightly, though her eyes remained cold. Julian's right. It's theatrical nonsense. The police should focus on real evidence, not fairy tales. Miss Marple nodded as if in agreement, but her mind was elsewhere. The nursery rhyme, Sing a Song of Sixpence, was no mere whimsy. Its lines spoke of wealth, betrayal, and hidden truths. 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. Sir Henry, the king, had been struck down in his counting house, his empire of wealth. The rye was a signature, but whose, and why? She turned to Clara, her voice soft. You mentioned Henry's restlessness, Clara. Did he ever speak of his will, or changes to it? Families, you know, can be so complicated. Clara's eyes widened, and she glanced at Julian, who stiffened. His will? She said faintly. He did mention something a month ago. Said he was seeing Mr. Pembroke, the solicitor in London. I thought it was routine. Beatrice's smile faltered, and Julian set his glass down with a clink. Routine, he echoed, his voice tight. Father was always fiddling with his papers. Means nothing. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. Of course, she said. Just a thought. Families are so full of little secrets, aren't they? Like my nephew Raymond's wife, Joan. She once hid a dreadful painting. in the attic to spare his feelings. Harmless, but secrets do have a way of coming out. Clara managed a weak smile, but the room grew tense, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her shawl. "I mustn't keep you," she said. "Clara, do rest, my dear, and if you think of anything at all, you know where to find me." As Elsie showed her out, Miss Marple paused in the hall, her eyes catching a small detail. A coat rack by the door, where a man's scarf, unfamiliar and slightly worn, hung among the family's pristine garments. "Elsie," she said quietly, "whose scarf is that?" Elsie glanced at it, her face paling. I don't know, miss. It wasn't there yesterday. Maybe Mr. Lyle's. He left in a hurry last week." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the scarf's rough weave and faint tobacco scent. "Thank you, Elsie. You're a good girl. Mind you take care." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resumed but her thoughts racing. She recalled the nursery rhyme in full, its verses turning in her mind like pieces of a puzzle. "Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye 4, and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. Wasn't that a dainty dish to set before the king?" The king was Sir Henry, she was certain, his wealth and authority unmistakable. But the queen, the maid, the counting-house, what did they signify? Clara's nervousness suggested she knew more than she said, while Julian's defensiveness hinted at financial strain. Beatrice's coolness was a mask, but for what? And Mr. Lyle, with his sudden visits and forgotten scarf, was a shadow on the edges of the mystery. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village, where gossip often held grains of truth. She decided to visit Mrs. Carter at the post office the next morning, for Mrs. Carter missed nothing, from telegrams to whispered confidences. There was also Mr. Pembroke, the solicitor, whose name had sparked such unease. And the scarf, such a small thing. Yet Miss Marple knew that small things often unravelled the tightest knots. As the fire burned low, she set her knitting aside, her eyes bright with purpose. "People are so predictable," she murmured, "but so very clever at hiding it. Like blackbirds in a pie, their secrets always sing." The clock struck 6, and outside the village settled into dusk, unaware that Miss Marple's quiet interest had set in motion a chain of revelations that would soon lay bare the heart of Willow Grange's darkness. Chapter 4. The Second Death. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a reluctant glow, the sky bruised with clouds that promised rain. Willow Grange stood silent, its windows dark, as if the house itself mourned the loss of Sir Henry Ashford. The village, however, hummed with fresh gossip, the shock of his poisoning now layered with theories about the rye grains and the cryptic nursery rhyme. In the post office, Mrs. Carter dispensed stamps and speculation in equal measure, while at the Blue Boar, farmers debated whether Sir Henry's business rivals or a vengeful servant was to blame. Yet beneath the chatter, a sense of unease settled, as if the murder had cracked the village's placid surface, revealing something darker beneath. At Willow Grange, the household moved through the morning with the sluggishness of grief. Clara Ashford, pale and hollow-eyed, had taken to wandering the gardens, her shawl trailing behind her like a ghost. Julian, now the presumptive heir, spent his hours in the library, poring over his father's ledgers with a mixture of determination and dread. Beatrice maintained her impeccable composure, issuing orders to the staff with a quiet authority that belied the chaos of the past days. Elsie, the maid, flitted about her duties, her nervous glances betraying a fear that had not abated since Sir Henry's collapse. It was mid-morning when tragedy struck again, swift and merciless. Clara had ventured into the rose garden, a secluded corner of the estate where late-blooming blossoms clung to thorny stems. She carried a small glass of cordial, a habit she had adopted in recent weeks to steady her nerves. The gardener, old Mr. Timmins, saw her from a distance, seated on a wrought-iron bench, her head tilted back as if savouring the weak sunlight. He thought nothing of it until, an hour later, he passed the bench again and found her still there, her body slumped, her lips stained a strange vivid purple. The glass lay shattered at her feet, its contents seeping into the earth, and beside her, tucked into a cluster of roses, was a scattering of rye grains, their dark husks gleaming like malevolent eyes. Timmins's shout brought the household running. Julian arrived first, his face ashen as he knelt beside his mother, calling her name. Beatrice followed, her green eyes narrowing as she took in the scene, her hands clasped tightly before her. Elsie, summoned from the kitchen, let out a stifled cry and backed away, her apron pressed to her mouth. By the time Inspector Grayson was called, the rose garden had become a grim stage, its beauty marred by death's intrusion. Grayson arrived with his usual briskness, his notebook already open, his eyes scanning the garden with a predator's focus. Dr. Hargreaves, summoned, once more confirmed the cause of death with a grim nod. "Cyanide again," he said, sniffing the broken glass. "In the cordial, I'd wager. The purple staining on her lips is typical. Prussic acid leaves its mark. I'll need a full analysis, but it's the same hand, I'm sure of it." Grayson crouched beside the bench, his fingers brushing the rye grains nestled among the roses. "Two deaths, both poisoned, both with rye," he muttered. "This is no coincidence. Someone's playing a damnable game." He straightened, his gaze sweeping the family. Julian stood rigid, his hands clenched, while Beatrice's expression remained unreadable, though her eyes flicked briefly to the grains. Elsie hovered at the garden's edge, her face a mask of terror. The inspector began his questioning with Julian, whose voice was hoarse with shock. "Mother was fragile," he said, running a hand through his hair. "After father's death, she barely slept. She took that cordial every morning, said it calmed her. I never thought—" He trailed off, his eyes distant. "Where was the cordial kept?" Grayson asked, his pencil poised. "In the pantry," Julian replied. "Elsie prepared it daily, from a bottle in the medicine cabinet. It was just sugar syrup and herbs, nothing harmful." Grayson turned to Elsie, who flinched under his scrutiny. "Is that true, girl? You made the cordial?" "Yes, sir," Elsie stammered, her voice barely audible. "I mixed it this morning, like always. The bottle was sealed, I swear. I didn't— Oh, please, sir, I didn't do anything." "No one's accusing you," Grayson said, though his tone was stern. "Did anyone else handle the cordial, or the bottle?" Elsie shook her head, then hesitated. "Mrs. Beatrice was in the pantry yesterday evening," she said, her voice trembling. "She said she was checking the preserves, but I saw her near the medicine cabinet." Beatrice's lips tightened, but her voice was calm. "I was indeed in the pantry," she said. "The cook mentioned we were low on jam, and I wanted to see for myself. I didn't touch the cordial, Inspector. Elsie's imagination is running wild." Grayson jotted a note, his expression unreadable. He questioned Beatrice further, probing her movements that morning. She claimed to have been in her sitting room, writing letters, until Timmons's shout. Julian, she added, had been in the library, though she couldn't vouch for his exact whereabouts. Her words were precise, but Grayson sensed a calculated edge, as if she were measuring each syllable. The inspector examined the garden, noting the bench's isolation, shielded by tall hedges that blocked the view from the house. The rye grains, scattered with deliberate care, troubled him most. He found no note this time, no scrap of paper bearing the nursery rhyme, but the grains alone were enough to link Clara's death to Sir Henry's. He bagged them as evidence, his mind turning to the rhyme's next verse. The king was in his counting-house, counting out his money. The queen was in the parlour, eating bread and honey. Sir Henry the king was dead. Was Clara the queen struck down in her garden parlour? The thought chilled him, though he dismissed it as fanciful. Back at the house, Grayson gathered the household, in the drawing-room, its elegance now oppressive under the weight of another loss. Julian sat heavily, his head in his hands, while Beatrice stood by the fireplace, her posture rigid. Elsie lingered near the door, her eyes red from crying. The inspector's questions grew sharper, probing for motives. Clara's death, he reasoned, suggested she knew something, or was a threat to the killer. But what? Mrs. Ashford was nervous, Grayson said, addressing Julian. Did she mention anything unusual? A fear, a suspicion? Julian shook his head, his voice flat. She was shaken by father's death. Kept saying it wasn't right, that someone meant harm. I thought she was just grieving. Beatrice interjected, her tone measured. Clara was overwrought, Inspector. She spoke of enemies, but vaguely. Old business rivals of Henry's, nothing specific. I suggested she rest, but she insisted on her walks. Her words were sympathetic, yet Grayson noted a flicker of impatience, as if Clara's fragility had been a burden. Elsie, when pressed, offered a hesitant clue. Mrs. Ashford was frightened, sir, she whispered. Last night she came to the kitchen after dinner. Said she'd heard someone in the hall near Sir Henry's study. She thought someone was looking for something, wasn't it, cure? Eyes narrowed. Did she say what? Elsie shook her head. No, sir. She was trembling, though. Asked me to lock the kitchen door before I went to bed. The inspector made a note to search the study, suspecting Clara's fear was tied to her death. He dismissed the household, instructing them to remain on the estate, and turned his attention to the pantry. The medicine cabinet yielded the cordial bottle, half empty, its seal intact but easily tampered with. A faint bitter scent clung to the glass, confirming Hargreaves's diagnosis. Grayson sealed the bottle for analysis, his frustration mounting. The killer was meticulous, leaving no fingerprints, no obvious trace, save for the rye. Meanwhile, in St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, unaware of Clara's death, but deeply immersed in the mystery of Sir Henry's. Her visit to Willow Grange had left her with questions, and she had spent the morning sifting through village gossip, courtesy of Mrs. Carter at the post office. Mrs. Carter, a stout woman with a nose for secrets, had mentioned Mr. Lyle's frequent telegrams to London addressed to a Mr. Pembroke, a name that echoed Clara's mention of the solicitor. Miss Marple also learned of Julian's gambling debts, whispered about in the Blue Boar, and Beatrice's rumoured fondness for London society, where she was said to keep company with men of influence. As Miss Marple pondered, Florence burst in, her face alight with news. "Miss Marple, it's terrible! Mrs. Ashford, Clara, she's dead, found in the garden, poisoned, just like Sir Henry. And more rye grains, they say, right there with her. Miss Marple's knitting needles, stilled, her eyes sharpening. Clara, dead, she said softly, and so soon after Henry, and rye again. This is no random act, Florence. Someone is weaving a pattern, and we must see it clearly." She rose, her mind racing. Clara's death changed everything, escalating the danger and narrowing the field of suspects. The nursery rhyme, she reasoned, was a deliberate thread, its verses mapping the killer's mind. The Queen was in the parlour, eating bread and honey. Clara, in her garden, sipping her cordial, had met her end. The maid, the next figure in the rhyme, loomed ominously, and Miss Marple thought of Elsie, nervous and vulnerable. She resolved to visit Willow Grange again, but first she would call on Inspector Grayson, whose thoroughness, she suspected, needed a nudge in the right direction. By afternoon, Miss Marple arrived at the police station, a modest building near the village green. Grayson received her with polite surprise, his desk cluttered with reports. "Miss Marple," he said, rising, "I didn't expect you. You've heard about Mrs. Ashford, I presume?" "Indeed, Inspector," she replied, settling into a chair. "A dreadful business. 2 deaths, both poisoned, both marked by rye. It's the rhyme, isn't it, that troubles you?" Grayson's brow furrowed. "You've a sharp mind, ma'am." "Yes, the rhyme. Sing a song of sixpence. We found no note this time, but the grains are enough. I'm thinking it's a madman, or someone with a grudge against the family." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps," she said, "but madness is often a mask, Inspector. The rhyme is a distraction, I think, meant to obscure a simpler motive. Money, perhaps, or fear of discovery. Clara's death suggests she knew something the killer couldn't risk." Grayson leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "You've a theory, Miss Marple?" "Not a theory, dear Inspector, merely an observation. People are so predictable, you see, like my neighbour, Mrs. Finch, who hid her son's debts by selling her silver. Secrets have a way of surfacing, especially in families. Have you looked into Mr. Lyle, the visitor Clara mentioned, or Mr. Pembroke, the solicitor?" Grayson nodded, impressed. "Lyle's on my list. He's in London, claims he was consulting with Sir Henry on investments. Pembroke, too. I've sent a telegram. But what's your interest, ma'am? This isn't your usual knitting circle." Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who notices things, Inspector, like the scarf I saw at Willow Grange, rough, out of place among the family's things. Small details, you know, can unravel the tightest knots." Grayson made a note, promising to check the scarf. As Miss Marple left, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The inspector was capable, but he needed guiding, like a gardener pruning a rose. She returned to her cottage, her mind turning to the rhyme's next verse. The maid was in the garden, hanging out the clothes. Elsie, she feared, was in danger, and the killer's pattern was far from complete. At Willow Grange, the evening settled heavily. The house a fortress of grief and suspicion. Julian retreated to his father's study, his face haunted by the weight of 2 deaths. Beatrice moved through the rooms, her calm a brittle shell, while Elsie locked herself in her attic room, her prayers drowned by the wind's mournful howl. And in the rose garden the rye grains lay undisturbed, a silent promise of more darkness to come. Chapter 5. The Nursery Rhyme's Shadow. The rain that had threatened St. Mary Mead all morning arrived by noon, a steady drizzle that cloaked the village in a grey veil. The lanes turned muddy, and the church spire vanished into the mist, lending the countryside an air of melancholy that mirrored the gloom at Willow Grange. 2 deaths in as many days had shaken the village, and the whispers of poison and rye grains grew louder, weaving a tapestry of fear and fascination. In the tea-room, widows clucked over their scones, speculating about cursed families, while at the blacksmith's men spoke of Sir Henry's ruthless deals, wondering which enemy had struck. Yet no one, save perhaps a certain elderly spinster, saw the pattern emerging, a pattern as deliberate as the verses of a nursery rhyme. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. Her knitting lay idle, the needles still, as she stared at a piece of notepaper where she had written the full text of Sing a Song of Sixpence. The words, so familiar from childhood, now carried a sinister weight. Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. Wasn't that a dainty dish to set before the king? The king was in his counting-house, counting out his money. The queen was in the parlour, eating bread and honey. The maid was in the garden, hanging out the clothes, when down came a blackbird and pecked off her nose. Miss Marple's blue eyes, deceptively mild, traced the lines. Sir Henry, the king, had died in his dining-room, his wealth, his counting-house, ever at the forefront of his mind. Clara, the queen, had met her end in the rose garden, her cordial a bitter substitute for bread and honey. The rye grains, scattered at both scenes, were a signature, but the rhyme itself was the killer's voice, taunting or misdirecting. The maid, she feared, pointed to Elsie, whose nervous demeanour and proximity to the crimes made her vulnerable. But the blackbirds, those elusive, hidden truths, what were they? Secrets, Miss Marple suspected, buried in the Ashford family's past, ready to sing when the pie was opened. She sipped her tea, her mind sifting through the fragments she had gathered. Her visit to Inspector Grayson had confirmed Mr. Lyle's shifty presence and Mr. Pembroke's role as the family solicitor. But Clara's death had shifted the puzzle. Why kill Clara so soon after Henry? Fear of exposure, perhaps, or a need to silence her knowledge. The cordial tampered with in the pantry suggested someone with intimate access, someone within the household. Julian's debts, Beatrice's rumoured ambitions, Elsie's fear, and Lyle's mysterious visits all swirled in her thoughts, each a thread in a knot she had yet to untangle. A knock at the door broke her reverie. Florence entered, her apron dusted with flour, her face alight with fresh news. "Miss Marple, you'll never guess. They're saying at the post office that Sir Henry's will was changed just before he died. Mrs. Carter heard it from the solicitor's clerk, who came through yesterday, and there's talk of a row at Willow Grange, Julian and Beatrice shouting fit to wake the dead. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. A new will, and a quarrel, she murmured. How very interesting, Florence. Did Mrs. Carter say who benefited from the change? Florence shook her head. Not exactly, miss, but the clerk hinted it favoured Julian. Beatrice wasn't pleased, that's for sure. And Elsie's been telling folks she's scared to stay at the Grange, says the house feels wrong. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. A revised will explained much. Greed was a timeless motive, and families, in her experience, unravelled fastest over money. She recalled her cousin Ethel, whose inheritance disputes had turned siblings into strangers. Beatrice's displeasure and Julian's defensiveness suggested a rift, one the killer might exploit. Elsie's fear, meanwhile, was a warning, like a canary in a mine. Miss Marple decided to visit the post office herself, for Mrs. Carter's gossip, though embellished, often held kernels of truth. The rain had eased to a fine mist as Miss Marple set out, her umbrella bobbing above her black bonnet. The post office was a hub of activity, its counter crowded with villagers mailing letters or collecting parcels. Mrs. Carter, a plump woman with sharp eyes, greeted Miss Marple warmly, sensing a chance to share her latest tidbits. Terrible business at Willow Grange, Miss Marple, she began, handing over a stamp. First Sir Henry, now poor Mrs. Ashford. Poison, they say, and those queer rye grains. Makes my skin crawl, it does. Quite dreadful, Miss Marple agreed, her tone sympathetic. I hear there's talk of a will, Mrs. Carter. Something about Sir Henry making changes. Mrs. Carter leaned forward, her voice dropping. Oh, yes. My cousin's boy, who clerks for Mr. Pembroke in London, was here yesterday. Says Sir Henry came in a month ago, all in a huff, and redrew his will. Left most everything to Julian. Land, shares, the lot. Mrs. Beatrice got a pittance, and there was something about a trust for charity, which didn't sit well with anyone. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. How curious. And Mrs. Ashford, did she know of the change? Mrs. Carter shrugged. Can't say for sure, but she was at the Grange when the solicitor visited. My cousin's boy saw her in the hall, looking fretful. And that Mr. Lyle, the one who's been sending telegrams, he was there too, skulking about like a fox. Miss Marple thanked her, purchasing a postcard she didn't need, and stepped back into the mist. The will was a pivot, she thought, shifting motives like pieces on a chessboard. Julian's inheritance made him a target, or a suspect. Beatrice's reduced share gave her reason to resent, while Clara's knowledge of the change might have sealed her fate. And Lyle, with his telegrams and furtive presence, was a shadow she could not yet place. Her next stop was the vicarage, where Reverend Clements, a kindly man with a penchant for local history, might offer insight into the Ashford family's past. The vicarage was a rambling house, its garden overgrown with late roses. Clements welcomed her into his study, a cluttered room lined with books and smelling of pipe smoke. Miss Marple, a pleasure, he said, offering tea. Though I suspect you're here about the tragedy at Willow Grange. The village is quite shaken. Indeed, Reverend, she replied, settling into a worn armchair. 2 deaths, so sudden and strange. I wonder if you know anything of the old Ashford's history. Old ties, perhaps, or forgotten grudges. Clement stroked his chin, his eyes thoughtful. The Ashfords have been at Willow Grange for generations, you know. Sir Henry's father, old Sir Edmund, was a hard man, much like his son. There was a scandal, 30 years back. Edmund's brother Charles was cut off after a falling out. Something about a business deal gone sour. Charles left for Australia, and the family never spoke of him again. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A brother, estranged, how fascinating! And Sir Henry, did he ever mention this Charles? Not to my knowledge, Clement said, but Henry was private, even with the church. He gave generously, mind, you but kept his counsel. I do recall a curious incident, though, a year ago. A man came to the vicarage, asking about the Ashford family plot in the churchyard. Said he was researching genealogy. I thought little of it, but he had an odd manner. Shifty, you might say. Miss Marple's mind leapt to Mr. Lyle. Did he give a name? Clements frowned. Lyle, I believe. Yes, that was it. He didn't stay long, but he asked about Charles Ashford specifically. I told him what I knew, which wasn't much. Miss Marple thanked him, her thoughts racing. Lyle's interest in the family's past suggested a deeper connection, perhaps tied to the murders. She left the vicarage, her umbrella raised against the returning drizzle, and made her way to the Blue Boar, where the landlord, Mr. Higgs, was a font of village lore. The pub was warm and smoky, its tables filled with farmers and trades radix, astrum. Mr. Higgs, a burly man with a ruddy face, greeted Miss Marple with a grin. Miss Marple, what brings you here? Not often we see you in the Boar. Just a bit of fresh air, Mr. Higgs, she said, smiling, and perhaps a word about Willow Grange. The village is full of talk, you know. Higgs nodded, wiping a glass. Aye, grim business. Sir Henry and Mrs. Ashford both gone. They're saying it's poison, with rye grains left behind. Sounds like something out of a storybook. Miss Marple leaned closer. I hear Julian Ashford's had troubles, debts perhaps. Higgs's eyes narrowed. You've a sharp ear, Miss Marple. Aye, Julian's been in deep with some London types, gambling mostly. Word is, Sir Henry bailed him out more than once, but he was fed up. Threatened to cut him off, or so I heard from a bloke who delivers to the Grange. And Mrs. Beatrice, Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. She's a London lady, isn't she? Higgs chuckled. Oh, Beatrice loves her city life. Spends half her time there, hobnobbing with fancy folk. Some say she's got a gentleman friend, a lawyer type. Not that I'd gossip, mind. Miss Marple smiled. Of course not, Mr. Higgs. You're a model of discretion. She left a coin for a lemonade she barely touched and stepped back into the rain, her mind buzzing. Julian's debts and Beatrice's London connections were pieces of the puzzle, and Lyle's genealogical inquiries hinted at a hidden Ashford legacy. The rhyme, she thought, was a map, and the blackbirds, secrets of money, love, or lineage, were beginning to sing. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and spread her notes across the table. She drew a diagram, placing Sir Henry and Clara at the centre, with lines to Julian, Beatrice, Elsie, Lyle, and Pembroke. The will, she noted, was key. Julian's gain was Beatrice's loss, and Clara's knowledge might have threatened someone. Lyle's link to Charles Ashford suggested a past grievance, perhaps resurfacing now, and Elsie, the maid, was a loose thread, her fear a signal of danger. She recalled the rhyme's next line. The maid was in the garden, hanging out the clothes. Elsie's duties included laundry, and the Grange's garden was vast, with secluded corners where a blackbird might strike. Miss Marple resolved to warn Grayson about Elsie's safety, but first she would return to Willow Grange to observe the household under the strain of Clara's death. The next morning, Miss Marple arrived. At the Grange, her black handbag tucked under her arm. The house was quieter now, its grandeur dimmed by loss. Elsie opened the door, her face drawn, her eyes darting to the hall as if expecting a ghost. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "it's good you're here. It's not right, this place. I keep hearing noises, footsteps at night." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You're tired, my dear, but tell me, have you noticed anything odd? Something out of place, perhaps?" Elsie hesitated, then leaned closer. "There's a key missing, miss, to Sir Henry's desk in the study. I saw it last week, but now it's gone. And Mr. Julian, he was in there yesterday looking through papers." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "A missing key," she said softly. "Thank you, Elsie, you've been very helpful. Now, do stay close to the others, won't you? Safety in numbers." Elsie nodded, and Miss Marple was shown to the drawing-room, where Beatrice sat alone, her needlework abandoned. Her green eyes met Miss Marple's with a guarded look. "Miss Marple," she said, rising, "you're becoming a regular visitor. Is there something I can do for you?" "Just a neighbourly call," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "I wondered how you're managing with so much sorrow." Beatrice's lips twitched. "We manage as one must. Julian is occupied with his father's affairs. The police are everywhere, asking questions. It's exhausting." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to a photograph on the mantel. A younger Beatrice, laughing with a man in a London park. "You must miss the city," she said. "It's so lively compared to St. Mary Mead." Beatrice's expression softened, then hardened. "London has its charms, but my place is here. For now." Miss Marple smiled, sensing a crack in Beatrice's armour. She left soon after, her mind fixed on the missing key. The study, she thought, held answers. Papers, perhaps, or proof of Lyle's dealings. She would urge Grayson to search it, but discreetly, for the killer was watching, and the nursery rhyme's shadow was lengthening. As she walked home, the rain began again, a soft patter that matched her thoughts. The blackbirds were singing, and Miss Marple knew that soon the pie would open, revealing the truth in all its bitter clarity. Chapter 6. The Locked Drawer. The rain that had cloaked St. Mary Mead for days retreated at last, leaving behind a sky of brittle blue and a village that glistened with damp. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of wet earth and wood smoke, and the lanes of St. Mary Mead bore the marks of passing carts, their ruts gleaming like silver threads. Willow Grange, however, stood apart, its Georgian facade a sombre sentinel against the brightening day. The house seemed to hold its breath, its windows reflecting the sunlight with a cold, unyielding stare. 2 murders, Sir Henry and Clara, Ashford, both poisoned, both marked by rye grains, had cast a pall over the estate, and the village buzzed with theories, each more outlandish than the last. Yet within the Grange the truth lay hidden, locked away like a secret in a drawer, waiting for the right key. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her cottage's writing desk, was not one to indulge in fanciful speculation. Her morning had been spent reviewing her notes. The nursery rhymes sing a song of sixpence, scrawled at their centre like a spider in its web. The king and queen, Sir Henry and Clara, were dead, their deaths tied to wealth and betrayal. The maid, Elsie, remained a figure of concern, her fear a beacon in the fog of suspicion. The blackbirds, Miss Marple mused, were the secrets, debts, affairs, or forgotten kin that fluttered beneath the surface, ready to break free. Her visit to the Blue Boar and the vicarage had yielded vital threads. Julian's gambling debts, Beatrice's London connections, Mr. Lyle's interest in the Ashford lineage, and the revised will favouring Julian. The missing key to Sir Henry's desk, mentioned by Elsie, was a new piece, one that suggested hidden documents or truths the killer wished to conceal. As she sipped her morning tea, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Inspector Grayson. He was diligent, but his focus on facts sometimes blinded him to the human currents that drove such crimes. The locked drawer, she suspected, was a pivot, and she resolved to nudge Grayson toward it, gently, as one might guide a wayward vine. She penned a brief note, suggesting he examine Sir Henry's study for papers related to the will or Mr. Lyle's visits, and sent Florence to deliver it to the police station. Then, donning her tweed coat and a hat adorned with a single feather, she set out for Willow Grange, determined to observe the household in the wake of Clara's death. The walk was brisk, the village stirring with life. Mrs. Price, sweeping her doorstep, offered a sombre nod, while the baker's boy, delivering loaves, whispered of Elsie's latest fears. Miss Marple smiled, filing each tidbit away, for village gossip, like her, knitting, was a pattern of small stitches that formed a larger whole. At Willow Grange, the gravel drive crunched under her feet, and the house loomed larger, its silence oppressive. Elsie opened the door, her face pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice a whisper, "I'm glad you're here. It's worse, somehow, since Mrs. Ashford. Mr. Julian's like a storm, and Mrs. Beatrice, she watches everything." Miss Marple patted her arm. "You're doing splendidly, Elsie. Just keep your wits about you. Now, might I see Mr. Julian or Mrs. Beatrice? I've brought a few preserves for the household. Small comforts, you know." Elsie nodded, leading her to the morning room, a sunlit space with chintz armchairs and a view of the lawn. Julian was there, standing by a table strewn with papers, his shirt rumpled and his eyes bloodshot. He looked up, startled, then forced a smile. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained. "Kind of you to come. It's a wretched time." "My dear boy," Miss Marple said, setting her basket of preserves on the table, "I can only imagine. Losing both your parents so suddenly, it's a heavy burden. I thought a little jam might lift spirits, though it's small comfort." Julian's smile faltered. "You're good to think of us, but it's chaos here. The police, the questions. And now I've got to sort out Father's business. It's a mess." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the papers, ledgers, letters, and what looked like a contract. "Your father's affairs must be complex," she said. "I suppose his study holds many answers. Such a fine room, with that great desk. I recall seeing it at a charity tea years ago." Julian stiffened, his hand brushing a ledger. "The study's locked now. Too many people poking about. I'm handling things here." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, "though a locked desk can be so frustrating, can't it?" My nephew Raymond once lost a key to his bureau and found the most curious things when he finally opened it. Old letters, you know, that changed everything. Julian's jaw tightened, but before he could reply, Beatrice entered, her emerald dress a stark contrast to the room's soft tones. Her auburn hair was pinned tightly, and her green eyes assessed Miss Marple with a flicker of wariness. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth, "you're becoming our guardian angel. Preserves, how thoughtful." "Just a neighbourly gesture," Miss Marple replied, smiling. "I was saying to Julian how difficult it must be managing Sir Henry's affairs. So many papers, and that study, so full of secrets, I imagine." Beatrice's lips curved, but her eyes were cold. Secrets? Hardly. Henry was meticulous, but his business was straightforward. Julian's taking charge admirably. Miss Marple nodded, noting the tension between them. She excused herself, asking to use the powder room, and Elsie led her down the hall. As they passed the study, Miss Marple paused, her eyes catching the heavy oak door, its brass lock gleaming. "Is this where Sir Henry worked?" she asked, her tone innocent. "Yes, miss," Elsie whispered, "but it's locked now. Mr. Julian keeps the key, or he did, till it went missing." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Missing, you say? How curious! And no one's been inside?" Elsie glanced nervously behind her. "Not that I know, miss, but I heard noises last night, rustling, like someone was trying the door. I didn't dare look." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You're a brave girl, Elsie. Tell Inspector Grayson about those noises, won't you? Every detail matters." Back at the police station, Grayson received Miss Marple's note with a raised eyebrow. Her suggestion about the study aligned with Elsie's earlier mention of the missing key, and he decided to act. By afternoon, he arrived at Willow Grange with a constable, his expression resolute. Julian and Beatrice met him in the hall, their faces a study in contrasting emotions, Julian's agitation, Beatrice's icy calm. "Inspector," Julian said, his voice sharp, "what's this about? Haven't we had enough disruption?" "A routine search," Grayson replied, his tone firm. "We've reason to believe Sir Henry's study may hold evidence. I'd like access, please." Julian hesitated, then produced a key. "Not the desks, but the studies." "Fine, but you'll find nothing. Father's papers are in order." The study was a masculine domain, its walls lined with bookshelves, its air heavy with the scent of leather and tobacco. A massive mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface bare, save for a blotter and an inkstand. Grayson's eyes fixed on the locked drawer, its brass handle polished to a shine. "The key, Mr. Ashford?" he asked. Julian's face tightened. "It's missing. I told you, I've been working in the morning room." Grayson signalled the constable, who produced a small tool, and with a few deft movements, forced the lock. The drawer slid open, revealing a ledger, a bundle of letters, and a sealed envelope marked private. Grayson opened the ledger first, his eyes scanning columns of figures. The entries detailed payments to Mr. Lyle, thousands of pounds, labelled consulting fees, dated over the past 6 months. "Lyle," Grayson muttered. "What was he consulting on?" The letters were next, written in a sharp, slanted hand. They were from Lyle, addressed to Sir Henry, and their tone was unmistakable. Veiled threats, references to past indiscretions, and family matters best kept quiet. One letter mentioned Charles Ashford, Sir Henry's estranged brother, hinting at a debt unpaid. Grayson's pulse quickened. Blackmail, he thought, and a motive for murder. The sealed envelope contained a single sheet, a codicil to Sir Henry's will, dated a month prior. It confirmed the gossip. Julian inherited the bulk of the estate, with Beatrice receiving only a modest annuity. Clara, notably, had been granted a small trust, now moot with her death. Grayson bagged the documents, his mind racing. Lyle's payments suggested he was squeezing Sir Henry, but the codicil pointed to family tensions, Julian's gain, Beatrice's loss. He confronted Julian and Beatrice in the drawing-room, holding the ledger. "Care to explain these payments to Lyle?" he asked, his voice steely. Julian paled. "I didn't know about them. Father handled his own finances." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. Henry was private inspector. If he paid Lyle, it was his business. Perhaps he was investing. Grayson pressed further, showing them the letters. "These suggest blackmail. Any idea what Lyle had on your father?" Julian shook his head, his hands trembling. Beatrice's composure held, but her fingers twitched. "Henry had enemies," she said. "Old grudges, nothing more. You're chasing shadows, Inspector." Grayson let them go, but his suspicions deepened. He sent a telegram to London requesting Lyle's whereabouts and instructed the constable to guard the study. As he left, he noticed Elsie watching from the staircase, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay safe, girl," he said, but her nod was uncertain. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, back at her cottage, received a visit from Mrs. Carter, who brought news of Grayson's search. "They found papers, Miss Marple," she said, her voice hushed. "Something about that Lyle fellow, and a will. The village is all aflutter." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "How enlightening, Mrs. Carter! And what else do they say?" Carter leaned closer. "There's talk of a stranger seen near the Grange 2 nights ago, skulking by the gate. A man, thin, with a scarf. Some think it's Lyle, back to cause trouble." Miss Marple nodded, recalling the scarf she'd seen in the hall. She thanked Mrs. Carter and sat by the fire, her mind weaving the new threads. The locked drawer had yielded secrets, blackmail, a codicil, and Lyle's shadow. Julian's inheritance made him a target, but his ignorance of the payments rang false. Beatrice's calm was a facade, hiding resentment or worse. And Lyle, with his letters and genealogical queries, was a catalyst, stirring old wounds. She returned to the nursery rhyme, its verses a guide. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. The drawer was the pie, and the letters were the birds, revealing truths. But the maid's verse loomed, when down came a blackbird and pecked off her nose. Elsie, she feared, was next, her knowledge of the key and noises making her a threat. Miss Marple resolved to visit Grayson the next day, to share her concerns and urge protection for Elsie. At Willow Grange, the evening was tense. Julian retreated to the library, his whiskey glass refilled too often. Beatrice sat in her room, writing a letter to Mr. Pembroke, her pen moving with furious precision. Elsie, in the kitchen, scrubbed pots with trembling hands, jumping at every creak. Outside the wind rose, rattling the windows, and in the study the open drawer seemed to whisper of more secrets yet to be uncovered. Miss Marple, by her fire, closed her eyes, the rhyme echoing in her mind. The blackbirds were singing, and she knew the killer's next move was near. "People are so careless," she murmured, leaving their secrets where anyone might find them. Like a key, misplaced, but never truly lost. Chapter 7. The Maid's Tale. The twilight that settled over St. Mary Mead was soft and deceptive, its lavender hues masking the chill that crept through the village. The rain had ceased, leaving the air heavy with the scent of damp stone and fading roses. Willow Grange stood at the edge of the village, its silhouette stark against the fading light, its windows glowing faintly, as if reluctant to reveal the turmoil within. The murders of Sir Henry and Clara Ashford had woven a thread of dread through the community, and the rye grains, coupled with the nursery rhyme's eerie presence, fueled whispers of curses and vendettas. In the village hall, the sewing circle debated whether a madman or a scorned heir was to blame, while at the grocer's, old Mr. Tuttle swore he'd seen a stranger lingering near the Grange's gates, his scarf flapping like a warning. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her cottage, felt the weight of the mystery more keenly than most. Her parlour was a haven of warmth, the fire crackling, and the tea-tray set with her favourite Wedgwood. Yet her knitting lay untouched, her attention fixed on a small notebook where she had jotted the latest clues, the locked drawer's contents, Lyle's blackmail letters, the codicil favouring Julian, and payments disguised as consulting fees, Elsie's report of noises and the missing desk key, and the stranger's scarf, a rough anomaly in the Grange's polished halls. The nursery rhyme, Sing a Song of Sixpence, was the killer's script, its verses mapping the crimes. Sir Henry, the king, and Clara, the queen, were gone, and the maid, Elsie surely, was next in the rhyme's grim progression. The maid was in the garden, hanging out the clothes, when down came a blackbird and pecked off her nose. Miss Marple's concern for Elsie deepened, for the girl's fear and sharp observations made her both a witness and a target. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple reflected on the blackbirds, secrets, she was certain, that fluttered beneath the Ashford family's facade. Julian's debts, Beatrice's London ties, Lyle's probing into Charles Ashford's past, and the revised will were all feathers in the pie, ready to sing when exposed. The locked drawer had cracked the crust, revealing Lyle's blackmail, but the motive for murder remained elusive. Was it greed, revenge, or fear of exposure? And Lyle, pawn or puppeteer? His telegrams to Mr. Pembroke, the solicitor, suggested a deeper game, one Miss Marple intended to unravel. Her musings were interrupted by a hesitant knock. Florence, her maid, ushered in Elsie herself, the girl's face pale as moonlight, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Her grey uniform was crumpled, and her eyes darted to the parlour's corners as if expecting shadows to leap forth. "Miss Marple," Elsie said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know where else to go. I'm that frightened, miss, the Grange. It's like a trap, and I'm caught in it." Miss Marple rose, guiding Elsie to an armchair by the fire. "Sit, my dear, and have me some tea. You're safe here. Now, tell me everything slowly. What's happened to make you so afraid?" Elsie took a shaky sip from the cup Miss Marple pressed into her hands, her words spilling out in a rush. "It's Mrs. Beatrice, miss. Last night after dinner I was clearing the table, and I saw her in the pantry, holding a little glass vial. She didn't know I was there. I was in the doorway, quiet-like. She slipped it into her pocket, quick as you please, and looked so fierce I daren't breathe. I thought of Mrs. Ashford's cordial, and, oh, miss, I'm scared she's the one. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her voice remained gentle. A vial, you say? Did you see what was in it? Elsie shook her head. No, miss, it was too small, and the light was dim. But it wasn't medicine, I'm sure of it. And then this morning she caught me in the hall, staring, and she said, "Mind your own business, Elsie, or you'll regret it." Her voice was cold, like ice. I've not slept since. Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. Beatrice with a vial was a damning image, but appearances, she knew, could deceive. Her neighbour, Mrs. Lumley, had once been suspected of theft for pocketing a brooch, only to reveal it was a gift she'd meant to surprise her sister with. Still, Beatrice's threat to Elsie was a red flag, and the vial, if it held poison, linked her to Clara's death. Miss Marple needed more: context, motive, and proof. "Elsie," she said, "you were very brave to come to me. Have you told Inspector Grayson about this?" Elsie's eyes widened. "No, miss. Mrs. Beatrice would know it was me, and I'd be sacked or worse. I can't go back there, not now." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her tone was firm. "You must tell the inspector, my dear. He's a good man, and he'll protect you. But you needn't go alone. I'll come with you, and we'll see it done discreetly. For now, stay here. Florence will make up the spare room, and you'll be safe." Elsie nodded, tears brimming, and Florence, who had been listening from the doorway, bustled off to prepare the bed. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind turning to Beatrice. The woman's composure was a shield, but Elsie's tale suggested cracks. Anger, perhaps, or desperation. The codicil, cutting Beatrice's inheritance, gave her motive, and her London connections, possibly to Pembroke, hinted at alliances beyond the Grange. Yet the nursery rhyme's precision suggested a mind more calculating than impulsive, and Miss Marple wondered if Beatrice was the architect or a piece on the board. The next morning, Miss Marple and Elsie set out for the police station, the village, waking under a sky streaked with clouds. Elsie clung to Miss Marple's arm, her steps hesitant, but Miss Marple's calm presence steadied her. The station, a squat building with ivy creeping up its walls, was quiet, save for the clack of a typewriter. Inspector Grayson greeted them, his brow furrowing at Elsie's pale face. "Miss Marple, Elsie," he said, ushering them into his office. "This is unexpected. What's the matter?" Miss Marple nudged Elsie forward, her voice gentle. "Elsie has something to tell you, Inspector. Something important about Mrs. Beatrice." Elsie, trembling, recounted her story. The vial, Beatrice's fierce expression, the threat in the hall. Grayson's pencil flew across his notebook, his eyes narrowing with each detail. When Elsie finished, he leaned back, his expression grim. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "You're sure of what you saw, Elsie?" "Yes, sir," Elsie whispered. "I swear it." Grayson nodded, turning to Miss Marple. "You've a knack for finding witnesses, ma'am. This fits with what we found in the study. Those letters, from Lyle, hinting at blackmail. I'm wondering if Mrs. Beatrice was involved, maybe paying Lyle to stir trouble." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "It's possible, Inspector, but consider the rhyme. The maid was in the garden. Elsie's seen too much, and the killer knows it. I'd urge you to keep her safe. A boarding house, perhaps, with a constable nearby." Grayson frowned but nodded. "I'll arrange it. Elsie, you're to stay in the village under my protection until we sort this out. And you, Miss Marple, what's your take on this vial?" Miss Marple smiled, her tone mild. "Oh, I'm no detective, Inspector. But people do act on their fears, don't they? Like my friend Miss Hartnell, who hid her savings under the floorboards, thinking thieves were about. Beatrice may have a reason for that vial, poison, or something innocent. You'll find out, I'm sure." Grayson grunted, dismissing them with a promise to investigate. Miss Marple and Elsie returned to the cottage, where Florence had prepared a hearty breakfast. Elsie ate little, her eyes fixed on the window, as if expecting Beatrice to appear. Miss Marple, meanwhile, planned her next move. Grayson's focus on Beatrice was useful, but she suspected a broader web: Lyle, Pembroke, and perhaps the elusive Charles Ashford, whose shadow lingered in Lyle's inquiries. By afternoon, Miss Marple ventured to the village library, a quaint building filled with musty books and the scent of old paper. Miss Weatherby, the librarian, was a friend, her memory for local history rivaling Mrs. Carter's gossip. Miss Marple found her shelving novels, her glasses perched on her nose. "Jane," Miss Weatherby said, smiling, "you're here about the Ashfords, I presume. The village can talk of nothing else." Miss Marple nodded, settling at a reading table. "You've a sharp mind, Emily. I'm curious about the Ashford family. Sir Henry's father, Edmund, and his brother Charles. There was a scandal, I hear." Miss Weatherby's eyes lit up. "Oh, yes. I was a girl when it happened, but it was quite the talk. Edmund and Charles ran the textile business together, but Charles was reckless. Gambling, bad investments. They quarrelled over a deal with a Manchester firm, and Charles was accused of forging papers. Edmund cut him off, and Charles sailed for Australia, never to return. The family erased him, though I heard he had a son born abroad." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "A son? That's most interesting. And no word of him since?" "Not a peep," Miss Weatherby said. "But last year a man came to the library asking for old parish records. Said he was tracing the Ashford line. I showed him the ledgers, but he was particularly keen on Charles's baptism. His name was Lyle." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind racing. Lyle's obsession with Charles suggested a personal stake. Perhaps he was Charles's son, or an agent for him, seeking to reclaim a legacy. The blackmail letters, threatening to expose indiscretions, might concern this lost heir, or something darker in Sir Henry's past. She left the library, her steps purposeful, and headed to the telegraph office, where she sent a discreet message to a London acquaintance, Miss Climpson, who had contacts in legal circles. She asked for any record of Charles Ashford's descendants, or Lyle's dealings with Pembroke. Back at Willow Grange, the atmosphere was electric with suspicion. Grayson, acting on Elsie's tale, confronted Beatrice in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with ferns and the scent of damp earth. Beatrice sat on a wicker chair, her needlework in her lap, her expression one of controlled irritation. "Mrs. Ashford," Grayson began, his notebook open, "I've a witness who saw you with a vial in the pantry, the night before Mrs. Ashford's death. Care to explain?" Beatrice's needle paused, but her voice was steady. "A vial? Really, Inspector, this is absurd. I was in the pantry, yes, checking supplies. I may have picked up a bottle. Vinegar, perhaps, for the cook. Your witness is mistaken." Grayson's eyes narrowed. "And the threat you made to mind her own business? That was reported too." Beatrice's lips tightened. "Servants gossip, Inspector. I may have spoken sharply to Elsie. She's been careless lately. But a threat? Nonsense! I had no reason to harm Clara." Grayson pressed further, but Beatrice's answers were impenetrable, each word a brick in her defence. He left, frustrated, and searched the pantry, finding no vial, but noting the medicine cabinet's lock was flimsy, easily forced. He ordered a constable to watch Beatrice, sensing she was hiding something, though proof eluded him. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, Elsie safely tucked in the spare room. She reviewed her notes, the rhyme's verses circling her thoughts. The maid's danger was imminent, but Elsie's tale had shifted suspicion to Beatrice, whose motive, disinheritance, loomed large. Yet Lyle's role nagged at her, his letters and genealogical quest pointing to a past the Ashfords wished buried. Julian, too, was a question mark, his debts and access to the study making him a plausible culprit. The blackbirds were singing, and Miss Marple knew the pie was nearly open. She penned a second note to Grayson, urging him to trace Lyle's movements and search Beatrice's room for the vial, discreetly. As she sealed the envelope, a gust rattled the window, and she thought of Elsie, alone in the dark. "Poor child," she murmured, "the rhyme moves on, but we'll outwit it yet." At Willow Grange, the night was restless. Julian paced the library, his whisky glass empty. Beatrice burned her letter to Pembroke, her eyes hard. Elsie, in Miss Marple's cottage, dreamed of blackbirds, their beaks sharp as knives. And somewhere the killer watched, the nursery rhyme's next verse, already taking shape. Chapter 8. The Blackbirds. Sing, the morning light over St. Mary Mead was fragile, a pale gold that struggled through the mist, clinging to the village's lanes. The air was sharp with the promise of frost, and the hedgerows sparkled with dew, lending an ethereal calm to the countryside. Yet beneath this serene facade, a current of unease pulsed, fed by the murders at Willow Grange, Sir Henry and Clara Ashford's deaths, marked by cyanide and rye grains, had transformed the estate into a stage for tragedy, and the nursery rhyme's cryptic verses fueled whispers of a methodical killer. In the village shop, Mrs. Tuttle recounted Elsie's flight to London with dramatic flair, while at the church, the organist speculated about Beatrice's cold demeanour. St. Mary Mead, for all its pastoral charm, was a crucible of secrets, and the truth, like a blackbird, was beginning to sing. Miss Jane Marple sat at her dining table, a cup of Earl Grey cooling beside her notebook. The fire in the grate cast a warm glow, but her attention was fixed on the nursery rhyme. Its words scrawled in her neat hand: "Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. Sir Henry, the king, and Clara, the queen, were dead, their murders tied to wealth and hidden truths. Elsie, the maid, had narrowly escaped danger, her tale of Beatrice's vial and threat pointing to a crack in the household's facade. The locked drawer's contents, Lyle's blackmail letters, the codicil favouring Julian, and payments masked as fees, had opened the pie, and the blackbirds, Miss Marple knew, were the secrets now taking flight. Julian's debts, Beatrice's, London alliances, Lyle's probe into Charles Ashford's lineage, and a will that shifted fortunes. Yet the killer's motive, greed, revenge, or fear, remained elusive, and Miss Marple's mind turned to Elsie, whose safety was paramount. Her thoughts were interrupted by Florence, who entered with a tray of toast and a gleam of excitement. "Miss Marple, you'll never believe it! Elsie's back!" Inspector Grayson found her in London, at a boarding house in Bloomsbury. She's at the police station now, safe as houses, though scared out of her wits, they say. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Back and safe! That's splendid news, Florence. Did Mrs. Carter say more?" Florence nodded, setting the tray down. "Oh, yes. She heard from the constable's wife that Elsie ran off after Mrs. Beatrice threatened her. Said she was paid to leave, £10, slipped into her coat pocket with a note telling her to go to London and keep quiet. Elsie's talking to Grayson now, spilling everything." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. £10 and a note, she murmured. "A desperate move, Florence, to silence a witness. Elsie's return is a crack in the killer's plan, and we must make the most of it." She rose, her tweed coat already in hand, and resolved to visit the police station. Elsie's testimony could shift the investigation, and Miss Marple intended to ensure Grayson heard every detail. The village was stirring as she stepped out, her umbrella tucked under her arm despite the clear sky. The grocer's cart rattled past, and Miss Weatherby, the librarian, waved from her garden, her pruning shears glinting. Miss Marple returned the gesture, her mind cataloguing the village's pulse. Every glance, every whisper held a clue, for St. Mary Mead, like her knitting, was a pattern of small threads forming a larger truth. At the police station, a red brick building with a freshly painted door, she found Grayson in his office, his desk piled with reports. Elsie sat across from him, her mousy hair dishevelled, her hands clutching a handkerchief. A constable stood by, his notebook open, and the air was thick with tension. "Miss Marple," Grayson said, rising. "You're a magnet for this case, aren't you? Elsie's just told us a tale that's turned things upside down." Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair. "I'm merely a concerned neighbour, Inspector. Elsie, my dear, you're very brave. To come back. Tell me, what happened in London?" Elsie's voice was shaky but resolute. "I didn't want to go, miss, but I was so scared. After Mrs. Beatrice threatened me, said I'd regret it if I talked, I found £10 in my coat, with a note. It was typed, no name, saying to take the train to London and stay quiet, or I'd be next. I went to a boarding house in Bloomsbury, one I'd heard of from a cousin. I thought I'd be safe, but I kept thinking of Mrs. Ashford's cordial, and that vial. I couldn't stay silent." Grayson's eyes narrowed. "The note's gone. Elsie burned it. More's the pity. But the money's here." He slid a small envelope across the desk, revealing crumpled banknotes. "And you're sure it was Beatrice who threatened you?" Elsie nodded, tears brimming. "Yes, sir, in the hall, after I saw her with the vial. She looked at me like she hated me." Miss Marple's mind raced. The typed note suggested premeditation, and the money pointed to someone with means. Beatrice, perhaps, or another with access to the household's funds. The vial, if it held cyanide, linked Beatrice to Clara's death. But Elsie's fear suggested a broader threat. Miss Marple recalled her Aunt Matilda, who had once been bribed to leave a household after witnessing a theft, only to return when guilt outweighed fear. Elsie's courage was a turning point, but it made her a target. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle, "Elsie's testimony is vital, but she's in danger. The rhyme, 'The maid was in the garden,' marks her as the next victim. Might you place her somewhere secure, perhaps with a relative under watch?" Grace nodded, impressed. "Already arranged, ma'am. She's going to her aunt in Danemouth, with a constable escort. But this vile business, I'm searching Beatrice's room today. If we find it, we've got her." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A wise move, Inspector. But people are clever at hiding things, like my friend Miss Lavender, who kept her diary in a hollowed-out book. Look beyond the obvious and check Beatrice's correspondence. Her London ties may tell you more." Grayson jotted a note, dismissing Elsie to the constable's care. As Miss Marple left, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Elsie's return had cracked the pie open further, and the blackbirds, secrets of betrayal and fear, were singing loudly. She decided to visit the village seamstress Mrs. Dodd, whose shop was a hub for servants' gossip. Elsie's story might have reached other ears, and Mrs. Dodd's sharp tongue could reveal new threads. The seamstress's shop was a cosy nook, its windows draped with lace and its air scented with lavender. Mrs. Dodd, a wiry woman with nimble fingers, greeted Miss Marple with a knowing smile. "Hear about the Grange, I'll wager," she said, threading a needle. "The maids are all aflutter. Elsie's back, and they're saying Mrs. Beatrice is a poisoner." Miss Marple settled on a stool, her expression attentive. "The village does love a story, Mrs. Dodd. What have the maids heard?" Mrs. Dodd leaned closer, her voice low. "Plenty. The Grange's cook, Mrs. Bates, was here yesterday, mending a skirt. She says Elsie told her about the vial weeks ago before Mrs. Ashford died, but swore her to secrecy. Mrs. Bates also heard Mr. Julian arguing with Beatrice in the library night before last. Something about money. Julian shouting he'd not be cut out, and Beatrice saying he'd ruin them all." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "An argument about money," she murmured. "How illuminating! And anything about Mr. Lyle, the visitor?" Mrs. Dodd's eyes gleamed. "Oh, yes. The gardener's boy saw him at the Grange's back gate last week, passing a letter to someone. Couldn't see who. Looked furtive, he said, like he didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple thanked her, purchasing a spool of thread she didn't need, and stepped into the crisp air. The argument between Julian and Beatrice suggested a fracture, perhaps tied to the codicil or Lyle's blackmail. The letter at the gate was a new clue, linking Lyle to someone within the household. Beatrice, Julian, or another. She resolved to share this with Grayson. But first she visited the churchyard, where the Ashford family plot might offer insight into Charles Ashford's erasure. The churchyard was quiet, its gravestones weathered by time. Miss Marple found the Ashford plot, a grand affair with marble angels, and Sir Henry's fresh grave still unmarked. Clara's plot was prepared beside it, a sombre reminder of loss. She searched for Charles's name, but found none, confirming his banishment. Yet a small, neglected stone caught her eye, tucked behind a yew tree, inscribed with CA 1860-1890. The dates didn't align with Charles, but the initials intrigued her. She made a mental note to ask Reverend Clements about it, suspecting a family secret buried with the stone. Back at Willow Grange, Grayson's search of Beatrice's room was underway. The constable, under strict orders, combed through drawers and wardrobes, finding no vial but uncovering a locked jewellery box. Grayson forced it open, revealing a bundle of letters from Mr. Pembroke, the solicitor. The letters were formal, discussing legal matters, but one, dated a week before Sir Henry's death, was personal, urging Beatrice to secure her future before the old man changes his mind again. Grayson bagged the letters, his suspicions of Beatrice deepening, though the vial's absence frustrated him. He confronted Beatrice in the drawing-room, where she sat with a book, her composure unshaken. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, holding the letters, "these suggest you were plotting with Pembroke to influence Sir Henry's will. Care to explain?" Beatrice's eyes flicked to the letters, but her voice was cool. "Plotting, Inspector. I consulted Mr. Pembroke about my rights, as any wife might. Henry's decisions were his own. Those letters prove nothing," Grayson pressed, mentioning Elsie's testimony. But Beatrice's denial was swift. "Elsie's a hysterical girl, seeing threats where none exist. I've no vial, no poison. You're wasting time while the real killer laughs." Grayson left, unconvinced, and stationed a constable to watch the Grange. He telegraphed Pembroke, demanding an interview, and sent a report to London about Lyle's whereabouts. As night fell, the Grange was a fortress of suspicion, its occupants moving like pieces in a deadly game. Julian, in the billiard room, struck balls with reckless force, his face a mask of strain. Beatrice retired early, her door locked, her thoughts unreadable. Elsie, now in Danemouth, slept under a constable's guard, her dreams haunted by blackbirds. Miss Marple, at her cottage, lit a lamp and reviewed her notes. Elsie's return had exposed Beatrice's threat and the bribe, while the letters to Pembroke and Lyle's gate rendezvous added layers to the mystery. The churchyard stone, with its cryptic initials, hinted at a forgotten Ashford, perhaps tied to Lyle's quest. She recalled the rhyme's promise. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. The pie was wide open now, and the blackbirds, debts, betrayals, and buried kin were in full chorus. She penned a note to Grayson, suggesting he investigate the churchyard stone and Lyle's letter at the gate, and tucked it into her handbag for morning delivery. As she banked the fire, a gust shook the shutters, and she thought of Elsie, safe for now, but marked by the rhyme. "The killer's clever," she murmured, "but cleverness betrays itself, like a stitch dropped in a perfect row." At Willow Grange, the night was restless. Julian's billiard balls clacked into the small hours. Beatrice's lamp burned, late, her shadow pacing behind the curtain. And in the churchyard, the stone-marked CA stood silent, its secret waiting to sing. Chapter 9. The Counting House. The late spring dusk enveloped St. Mary Mead in a delicate shroud, the sky a tapestry of deepening indigo threaded with the last glimmers of gold. The village, with its thatched roofs and blooming hawthorns, seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing the storm brewing within Willow Grange. The murders of Sir Henry and Clara Ashford, each marked by cyanide and rye grains, had woven a web of fear through the community, and the nursery rhyme's cryptic verses, "Sing a song of sixpence," cast a shadow that grew longer with each passing day. In the village bakery, old Mrs. Hawthorne spun tales of vengeful spirits, while at the cobbler's Mr. Finch muttered about Sir Henry's ruthless deals, wondering who had finally struck back. Yet the truth, like a coin in a counting-house, lay hidden, waiting for a keen eye to tally its worth. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage's conservatory, a small glass-walled haven where geraniums bloomed in defiant bursts of red. The evening air was cool, scented with earth and lavender, and a single lamp cast a soft glow over her notebook, where the nursery rhymes verses were neatly transcribed. Sir Henry the King had died in his dining room, his wealth, his counting-house, his legacy. Clara the Queen had fallen in the rose garden, her cordial laced with poison. Elsie, the maid, had narrowly escaped the rhyme's next verse. Her flight to London and safe return, exposing Beatrice's threat and bribe. The blackbirds, secrets of debts, betrayals, and buried kin, were singing loudly now, thanks to the locked drawer's revelations. Lyle's blackmail letters, the codicil, favouring Julian, and payments masked as fees. Yet the killer's hand remained elusive, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the counting-house, the rhyme's symbol of greed that pulsed at the heart of the Ashford family. Her morning had been productive, spent sifting through replies from her London acquaintance, Miss Climpson, who had traced Mr. Lyle's connections to Mr. Pembroke, the solicitor. A discreet inquiry revealed Lyle had visited Pembroke's office multiple times, discussing family matters tied to the Ashfords, though specifics were vague. Miss Climpson also uncovered a record of Charles Ashford's son, Edward, born in Australia and last known to be in London in 1920, though his current whereabouts were unknown. Miss Marple suspected Lyle was either Edward or his agent, stirring old grievances for profit or revenge. The churchyard stone marked CA 1860-1890, likely Charles's child, added another layer. A forgotten Ashford whose existence might have sparked Lyle's blackmail. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple considered Elsie's safety. Now in Danemouth under a constable's watch, the girl was secure. But her testimony about Beatrice's violent threat had shifted suspicion. Beatrice's reduced inheritance, coupled with her letters to Pembroke, suggested a woman desperate to secure her future. Julian, meanwhile, with his debts and access to the study, was equally suspect. His inheritance a double-edged sword. The rhyme's next verse. The maid was in the garden, hanging out the clothes, loomed, and Miss Marple feared the killer's pattern was not yet broken. She resolved to visit Willow Grange, to gauge the household's pulse and nudge Inspector Grayson toward the counting-house's truths. The village was quiet as she set out, her black shawl draped over her shoulders, her handbag a repository of notes and intuition. The lane to Willow Grange was lined with budding roses, their petals glistening with evening dew, and the air carried the faint chime of the church bell, marking the hour. At the Grange, the iron gates stood open, but the house felt fortress-like, its windows shuttered against prying eyes. The butler, a dour man named Hawkins, answered her knock, his expression one of weary resignation. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "Mrs. Beatrice is in the library, and Mr. Julian's somewhere about. It's a trying time, ma'am." "And I quite understand, Hawkins," Miss Marple replied, her tone sympathetic. "I've brought a small posy for the household. Flowers can brighten even the darkest days." She held out a bundle of daisies, their simplicity a contrast to the Grange's opulence. Hawkins led her to the library, a cavernous room with oak shelves and a long table strewn with books. Beatrice sat by a tall window, her emerald dress catching the lamplight, a ledger open before her. Her auburn hair was pinned tightly, and her green eyes met Miss Marple's with a flicker of impatience. "Miss Marple," she said, rising, "your visits are becoming a habit. Flowers, how charming! But I'm afraid we're rather preoccupied." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, setting the posy on the table. "Such a dreadful time. I was just thinking of Sir Henry's. Business so vast, like a counting-house, wouldn't you say? It must be a burden for you and Julian." Beatrice's lips tightened, but her voice was smooth. "Julian's managing, with help from the solicitors. Henry's affairs were complex, but we'll sort it out." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the ledger, its pages filled with figures. "I'm sure you will. My nephew Raymond once inherited a shop, and oh, the papers! He found the most curious things in old ledgers, debts, promises, even a love letter. Families are so full of surprises." Beatrice's hand paused on the ledger, her expression guarded. "Surprises, perhaps, but nothing untoward. If you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Miss Marple smiled, excusing herself, but not before noting a photograph on a side table. Beatrice and Pembroke, standing close at a London gala, his hand on her arm. She filed it away, her suspicions of Beatrice's motives sharpening. As Hawkins showed her out, she glimpsed Julian in the hall, his face flushed, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. He nodded curtly, his eyes avoiding hers, and Miss Marple sensed a man on the edge, his inheritance a weight he could barely carry. Her next stop was the police station, where Inspector Grayson was poring over reports. The room smelled of ink and tobacco, and a map of St. Mary Mead was pinned to the wall, the Grange marked in red. Grayson looked up, his square jaw set, his eyes weary but alert. "Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to a chair, "you've a knack for timing. I was about to send for you. We've got Pembroke coming tomorrow, and Lyle's been traced to a London hotel. Elsie's safe in Danemouth, but her stories stirred things up." Miss Marple settled, her handbag in her lap. "I'm glad to hear it, Inspector. Elsie's courage has opened doors, hasn't it? And those letters from Pembroke to Beatrice. Most revealing, I imagine." Grayson nodded, sliding a file across the desk. "You've a sharp mind, ma'am. The letters suggest Beatrice was pushing Pembroke to challenge the codicil, but there's no proof of poison. We searched her room again. Nothing. I confronted her this morning, and she's all ice, denying everything." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Ice can crack, Inspector. Tell me, what did Beatrice say?" Grayson flipped open his notebook. She admitted to the affair with Pembroke, said it was a friendship that Henry misunderstood, claimed she loved Clara and had no reason to harm her, said Elsie's lying or mistaken about the vial. I don't buy it, but she's slippery. "And Julian?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. Grayson sighed. "He's a wreck. Found him in the study last night, half drunk, reading one of Lyle's letters. He let slip something new. Said he found a note in the drawer, not one we saw, hinting at Lyle's blackmail. Claimed it mentioned a family shame that could ruin the Ashfords. He burned it, says he panicked. Foolish, but I believe him. He's too rattled to lie well." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "A burned note," she murmured. "How vexing but telling. Lyle's blackmail is the key, Inspector. Have you looked into Charles Ashford's son, Edward, or the churchyard stone marked CA?" Grayson's brow furrowed. "Edward Ashford. First I've heard of him. And the stone. I'll send a man to check it. You think Lyle's tied to this Edward?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "People hide their past, like my cousin Gertrude, who buried a scandal by moving to Cornwall. Lyle's after something, money or justice. And the counting house, Sir Henry's wealth, is the motive, don't you think?" Grayson leaned back, impressed. "You're ahead of me, ma'am. I'm meeting Pembroke tomorrow, and I'll press him on Lyle and Beatrice. Julian's on my radar too. Those debts make him desperate. I've got a constable watching the Grange, and I'm digging into Lyle's hotel records." Miss Marple nodded, rising. "You're doing splendidly, Inspector, but do keep an eye on the rhyme. The maid was in the garden. Elsie's safe, but the killer may shift targets. Small things, you know, like a misplaced key, can unravel everything." Grayson smiled, a rare warmth in his eyes. "I'll keep that in mind, Miss Marple. You're a force, you know that." Miss Marple chuckled, waving off the compliment, and left the station, her mind buzzing. The burned note was a loss, but Julian's admission confirmed Lyle's leverage. A family shame, likely tied to Charles or his son. Beatrice's affair and financial desperation made her a strong suspect, but Julian's volatility couldn't be ignored. She decided to visit the village inn, the Red Lion, where travellers often left traces, hoping to uncover more about Lyle's movements. The Red Lion was a sturdy building, its sign creaking in the breeze, its taproom alive with the clink of glasses and the murmur of locals. Mr. Stokes, the innkeeper, was a jovial man with a memory for faces, and he greeted Miss Marple with a grin. "Miss Marple, a rare treat," he said, wiping the bar. "What brings you here? Not the murders, I hope?" Miss Marple smiled, ordering a lemonade. "Oh, just a chat, Mr. Stokes. I hear a gentleman named Lyle stayed here recently. A thin man, perhaps, with a scarf." Stokes's eyes lit up. "Aye, that's him. Stayed 2 nights, week before Sir Henry died. Kept to himself, but I saw him talking to a fellow in the yard. Sharp-looking chap, city type. They were arguing quiet-like about papers. Lyle left early, said he was for London." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. A city type, perhaps a solicitor, like Mr. Pembroke? Stokes shrugged. Could be. Had a briefcase anyway. And Lyle got a telegram while he was here. Burned it in the grate, but I saw the envelope. From a London office, I reckon. So Marple thanked him, her mind racing. Lyle's meeting with a city man. Pembroke, likely. Linked him to Beatrice's circle, and the burned telegram echoed Julian's destroyed note. She left the inn, the dusk deepening, and headed to the church, where Reverend Clements might shed light on the CA stone. The church was silent, its stained-glass windows dark. Clements was in the vestry, sorting hymnals, and welcomed Miss Marple with a tired smile. "Jane, you're out late," he said. "The Ashfords, I presume." Miss Marple nodded, settling on a pew. "I'm curious about the churchyard, Reverend. There's a stone marked CA, 1860-1890. Could it be an Ashford?" Clements frowned, consulting a ledger. "Let's see. Yes, here it is. Charlotte Ashford, Charles's daughter, died young. Consumption, I believe. The family buried. Her quietly, no fuss. Charles was already estranged, so it's a small marker. Miss Marple's mind whirred. Charlotte, not Charles, but still a link to the lost brother. Lyle's interest in the Ashford line might extend to her. Perhaps a debt or legacy tied to her death. She thanked Clements and left, the night air sharp against her cheeks. The counting-house, money, power, secrets, was the heart of the murders, and Lyle's role was clearer, though not complete. Back at Willow Grange, Grayson's investigation intensified. He interviewed the cook, Mrs. Bates, who confirmed Elsie's story about Beatrice's vial, adding that Beatrice had been in the pantry often, checking supplies before Clara's death. Grayson searched the library, finding a hidden compartment in the desk, empty but dusted with rye grains, a chilling echo of the murders. He confronted Julian again, who admitted to searching the study for Lyle's note, fearing it exposed his debts. "You burned evidence, Mr. Ashford," Grayson said, his voice hard. "What did it say?" Julian's hands shook. It said, "Lyle knew something about father, something that'd ruin us. I thought it was about my debts, but it mentioned a child, someone lost. I panicked, Inspector." Grayson's jaw tightened. "A child? Charles's, maybe?" Julian shrugged, his eyes haunted. "I don't know. Father never talked about him." Grayson let him go, his suspicions split between Julian's desperation and Beatrice's cunning. He telegraphed London, requesting Edward Ashford's records, and planned to search the Grange's attic, where old family papers might hide. Miss Marple, at her cottage, lit a lamp and reviewed her notes. The counting-house was the motive, Julian's, inheritance, Beatrice's loss, Lyle's blackmail, and a child's shadow. The rye grains in the desk were a taunt, the killer's signature. She penned a note to Grayson, urging him to check the attic and trace Pembroke's meeting with Lyle at the Red Lion. As she sealed it, the wind howled, and she thought of the rhyme's final verse. Wasn't that a dainty dish to set before the king? The dish was served, and the killer's hand was near. At Willow Grange, the night was fraught. Julian sat in the dark, a bottle at his elbow. Beatrice wrote another letter, her pen scratching furiously. The attic's trapdoor creaked, unnoticed, and in Danemouth, Elsie slept, unaware of the blackbirds circling closer. Chapter 10. Miss Marple's Revelation. The twilight of late spring draped St. Mary Mead in a gentle veil, its soft purples and golds softening the village's thatched roofs and winding lanes. The air was fragrant with lilac and freshly turned earth, a deceptive calm that belied the storm that had raged at Willow Grange. The murders of Sir Henry and Clara Ashford, each marked by cyanide and rye grains, had gripped the village in a quiet terror, and the nursery rhyme, "Sing a Song of Sixpence," had become a sinister refrain, its verses whispered in the bakery and murmured at the forge. The blackbirds, secrets of greed, betrayal, and buried kin, had sung loudly, their chorus amplified by Elsie's testimony, the locked drawers' revelations, and Miss Jane Marple's relentless curiosity. Now, as the mystery neared its close, the village held its breath, sensing the final note of a deadly melody. Miss Marple sat in her cottage's drawing-room, the curtains drawn against the evening chill, a single lamp casting a golden pool over her notebook. The nursery rhyme, transcribed in her precise hand, lay at the heart of her notes. Its verses a map of the killer's mind. Sir Henry, the king, poisoned at his breakfast table. Clara, the queen, struck down in the rose garden. And Elsie, the maid, spared by her flight to London, but marked by the rhyme's grim promise. The locked drawer had yielded Lyle's blackmail letters, a codicil favouring Julian, and payments disguised as fees. Elsie's tale of Beatrice's vile and threat had pointed to one suspect, while Julian's debts, Beatrice's London ties, and Lyle's probe into Charles Ashford's lineage wove a complex web. The counting-house, Sir Henry's wealth, had been the motive. And now Miss Marple was ready to open the pie and let the blackbirds sing their final song. Her morning had been busy, spent corresponding with Inspector Grayson and arranging a gathering at Willow Grange. A telegram from Miss Climpson in London had confirmed Edward Ashford's death in 1923, ruling out Lyle as Charles's son, but revealed Lyle's history as a private investigator, hired by Pembroke to dig into the Ashford's past. The churchyard stone, Charlotte Ashford's grave, had been a red herring, but Lyle's blackmail centred on Sir Henry's role in Charles's ruin. A forged contract that had driven Charles to Australia. This shame, Miss Marple reasoned, was the leverage Lyle used, but the murders were personal, rooted in the Grange's inner circle. She had pieced together the killer's moves, and tonight she would lay them bare. At 6 o'clock, Miss Marple arrived at Willow Grange, her black handbag tucked under her arm, her lavender shawl a soft contrast to the house's stern facade. The evening was cool, the gravel drive gleaming under the rising moon, and the Grange's windows glowed with an uneasy light. Hawkins, the butler, greeted her with a strained nod, his usual composure frayed by weeks of tragedy. "Miss Marple," he said, leading her to the drawing-room. "The others are waiting. It's a sombre gathering, ma'am." "I quite understand, Hawkins," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. "But sometimes a little clarity brings peace, even in dark times." The drawing-room was a study in elegance, its damask curtains and marble fireplace at odds with the tension that crackled within. Inspector Grayson stood by the hearth, his notebook in hand, his square jaw set with determination. Julian Ashford slouched in an armchair, his dark hair dishevelled, a glass of whisky trembling in his hand. Beatrice sat on a sofa, her emerald dress immaculate, her green eyes wary but composed. Elsie, back from Danemouth under Grayson's protection, hovered near the door, her mousy features taut with nerves. Mr. Lyle, summoned from London, stood by a bookcase, his wiry frame tense, his shifty eyes darting between faces. The air was thick, the silence broken only by the ticking of the Ormolu clock. Miss Marple took a seat, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of serene authority. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice soft but commanding. "This has been a dreadful affair. 2 lives lost, a family torn apart, and a nursery rhyme twisted into a killer's taunt. But tonight we shall have the truth, for secrets, like blackbirds, cannot stay hidden forever." Grayson nodded, his eyes fixed on her. "Miss Marple's been a great help, and she's asked to share her thoughts. Go on, ma'am." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, lingering on each face. "The nursery rhyme was a clever mask," she said, "but murder is rarely so poetic. Sir Henry was poisoned for his wealth, Clara for her knowledge, and Elsie was silenced to protect the truth. The rye grains, the rhymes verses, they were meant to confuse, to suggest a madman or a vendetta. But the motive was simpler, rooted in the counting-house, money, and the fear of losing it. She turned to Julian, whose glass paused at his lips. "You, Julian, were desperate," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Your gambling debts were a noose, tightening with each loss. Your father's new will, leaving you everything, was your salvation. But only if he died before changing it again. You knew of Mr. Lyle's blackmail, didn't you? Those letters in the locked drawer, threatening to expose your father's role in your Uncle Charles's ruin." Julian's face paled, his voice hoarse. "That's absurd, Miss Marple. I didn't know about the letters until Grayson found them." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, but you did, my dear. You found one letter earlier, the one you burned, claiming it mentioned a family shame. You said it was about your debts, but it was about Charles, a truth you used to muddy the waters. You poisoned your father's tea, knowing Elsie would serve it and scattered rye grains to echo the rhyme, a childish touch to suggest madness." Beatrice's lips parted, her voice sharp. "Julian, that's preposterous. He's weak, but not a murderer." Miss Marple turned to her, unruffled. "You, Beatrice, were a convenient scapegoat. Your affair with Mr. Pembroke, your anger at the codicil, and Elsie's tale of the vial made you look guilty. But the vial was a plant, wasn't it, Julian? You placed it in the pantry, knowing Elsie would see you, or someone dressed as you, and suspect Beatrice. Your argument with Beatrice in the library, overheard by Mrs. Bates, was staged to deepen the ruse." Julian's glass slipped, shattering, on the floor. "This is madness!" he shouted, his face flushed. "You've no proof!" Miss Marple's voice grew firmer, her eyes piercing. "Clara was your second mistake. She saw you tamper with the tea, didn't she? Her nervousness, her talk of enemies in the pantry. It was you she feared. You poisoned her cordial, slipping cyanide into the bottle when Elsie was distracted, and left rye in the rose garden to link the crimes. But Elsie's flight to London, that threw you. You bribed her to leave, typing that note to make it seem like Beatrice's doing. But Elsie's conscience brought her back. Grayson stepped forward, his voice steady. "Miss Marple, that's a strong case. Julian, what do you say?" Julian's hands clenched, his voice breaking. I couldn't. Lyle's the blackmailer. He's the one who wanted father dead." Miss Marple turned to Lyle, who shrank under her gaze. "Mr. Lyle, you were indeed a catalyst," she said. "Hired by Pembroke to dig into the Ashfords, you found Charles's story, a forged contract that ruined him, and blackmailed Sir Henry. You passed letters, met Pembroke at the Red Lion, and stirred old wounds. But you didn't the killer. Your greed was a tool used by Julian to create chaos. You profited, didn't you, by lying to Grayson, pointing to Beatrice?" Lyle's face twisted, his voice low. I took money, yes. Julian paid me to muddy things, to say Beatrice was scheming. But I didn't kill anyone." Beatrice's eyes widened, her voice trembling. "Julian paid you, you vile little man." Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice calm. "Beatrice, you were ambitious, but not a murderer. Your letters to Pembroke were about securing your future, not poison. Julian exploited your affair, planting the vial to frame you. And Elsie Poor Elsie, you were the maid in the garden, meant to be silenced. But your courage and a little village gossip brought the truth to light." Elsie sobbed, clutching her handkerchief, and Grayson placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did well, girl," he said, then turned to Julian. "Mr. Ashford, you've heard Miss Marple? We found cyanide traces in the study's inkstand, where you hid it, and the typed note to Elsie. Your typewriter's ribbon matches. What's your answer?" Julian's shoulders slumped, his face crumpling. "I had no choice," he sobbed, his voice raw. "The debts. They'd have killed me. Father was going to cut me off, give it all to charity. I thought, if he was gone, I'd be free. Mother suspected. She saw me with the tea. I couldn't let her talk. The rhyme, it was to throw you off, make it look like a lunatic." Trish stared, her composure shattered. "You monster!" she whispered. "Clara, Henry, for money." Grayson signalled the constable, who stepped forward with handcuffs. "Julian Ashford, you're under arrest for the murders of Sir Henry and Clara Ashford," he said, his voice firm. Julian offered no resistance, his sobs echoing as he was led away. Lyle shifted, his eyes darting to the door, but Grayson's glare pinned him. "You're not off the hook, Lyle. Blackmail's a crime, and you'll answer for it." Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping slightly. "Thank you, Inspector," she said, her voice soft. "It's a sad business, but the truth is better out, like a stain washed clean." Beatrice stood, her face pale but resolute. I misjudged you, Miss Marple. Thank you." Elsie rushed forward, hugging Miss Marple tightly. "You saved me, miss," she whispered. "I'll never forget it." Miss Marple patted her back, her eyes kind. "You saved yourself, Elsie. Courage is a powerful thing." As the group dispersed, Grayson walked Miss Marple to the door, the moon now high over the Grange. "You're a marvel, ma'am," he said, shaking his head. "How'd you see it all?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "People are predictable, Inspector, like my nephew Raymond's dog, always hiding bones in the same spot. The rhyme was a distraction. But greed leaves tracks, clear as day." She stepped into the night, the gravel crunching under her feet, and made her way home. The village was silent, its secrets laid bare, and Willow Grange stood quiet, its shadows lighter now. At her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp, poured a cup of tea, and picked up her knitting. The nursery rhyme echoed faintly, its blackbirds stilled, their song complete. "Such a pity," she murmured, her needles clicking, "but secrets always sing in the end."